This is the X-21A taking off from Hawthorne Airport.
We're at the Hawthorne Municipal Airport, Jack Northrop Field. We're at the Western Museum of Flight this morning, and we're here with Jerry Hubin, who's a long-time Northrop employee, very long time. Jerry, you started with Northrop in about 1939?
1941.
1941.
Just before Pearl Harbor.
And you started as an engineer?
I started as a riveter, but then within a few months I became an engineer.
And you've been a project engineer on many of the Northrop aircraft that have flown missions and participated in the war effort.
That's right. Probably the one I loved best was the YF-17.
And we're going to get a chance to see that. Yeah. We have one here, don't we?
And that became the predecessor for the F-18, which served in the Gulf War. Okay, the YF-17 was our attempt to follow on with a faster and larger airplane than the F-5, because we knew the customers are always looking for something bigger and faster and stronger. That's what led to the design of this airplane. And it's a supersonic airplane. It flies about 1.8 Mach number, which is like 1,500 miles an hour. And this airplane eventually turned out to be the Navy F-18. And the F-18 served in the Gulf War, and we're still building the F-18 now in El Segundo.
And this is a twin engine?
This is a twin engine airplane, one pilot, and has a 20 millimeter cannon, and can carry a variety of bombs on the pylons. That's a 600-gallon fuel tank they used to fly this airplane to Paris. This airplane actually went to the Paris Air Show.
Really?
Yes.
And on the end of the wings?
That's the Sidewinder missile.
Sidewinder missiles, right here in Hawthorne.
Yeah, right here in Hawthorne. Very successful missile, infrared guided.
Infrared guided Sidewinder missiles. 600 gallons of fuel is on each side?
Yeah, that was enabled the airplane to fly from Newfoundland to Greenland to Iceland to England to Paris. And ordinarily, we wouldn't carry a tank this big, but probably be bombs or some other thing.
A gallon of aviation fuel, I think, weighs about 8 1/3 pounds. Jet fuel's a little heavier, isn't it?
Right.
So what would this airplane fully loaded with fuel and weaponry weigh, do you think?
About 40,000 pounds.
And it can still fly at 1,500 miles an hour.
Yes, that's right.
That's quite a task. And of course, you were part of the team that helped design this.
Right.
Right. What would be the difference between this and the YF-23?
The YF-23 was a still faster airplane
than this one.
It was one more step beyond this airplane, and it was designed to be a stealthy airplane also. The significant feature about the YF-23 is that it could go supersonic cruise. Whereas these airplanes, the YF-17 and the F-5, could only go supersonic when you had the afterburner on, which used up a great amount of fuel. But the YF-23 could cruise supersonically on military power. So it's fairly fuel efficient at that speed.
So for people that don't understand what it is, at what speed in miles per hour would you be supersonic?
Ground speed would be about 1,500 miles an hour.
And then you're supersonic. This airport has a lot of history, some things that I know you've seen personally. The original Flying Wing flew out of here.
That's right.
And that was about 1949.
1949. I watched that. Very thrilling.
And could you describe what it was like when it took off?
Well, it started out at Prairie Avenue and down the runway, headed toward Crenshaw Boulevard. About 500 feet before Crenshaw, it broke ground and headed on up to Western Avenue.
And so the people that live east of the airport must have thought the Martians were here,
They must have been very,
because it was a very odd-looking thing to be flying at that time, I would
Yeah.
think.
made a lot of noise.
And we have something like that behind us, don't we?
Yes. Well, this is the Northrop, call it the Buzz Bomb. It was the United States' answer to the German V-1. And it carried two 500-pound bombs. And this was piloted, but there was really no intention to have a pilot. It was going to be a drone type thing.
And so this one was piloted, and it was jet-powered?
This was rocket powered and contained a pilot just to do the test flying. And that proved out fine.
And how many of the aircraft that we've seen outside, you were project engineer on many, many of them. The F-5, the Y-17, the Y-23.
A9, N-156, just about every airplane we built.
And so you spent a lot of time here at the Hawthorne Airport at Northrop Corporation.
Right, I started here in '41, and there was nothing on the north side of 120th Street. It was all empty fields. And there wasn't even a 120th Street. It was just a dirt path.
A dirt road. And so during the war effort, employment opportunities in Northrop must have just mushroomed and grown.
Yeah, it was difficult to get a job in engineering before the war, but then after the war started, things did blossom. And there were a lot of opportunities for engineers. There were also a lot of opportunities for women to join the force. Rosie the Riveter.
And that's what Hawthorne's famous for, Rosie the Riveter.
That's right, and they did a fantastic job. They were very good at it.
And there were some stories that I've heard about veterans that came back. There were a lot of opportunities for veterans themselves to work after their tour was over.
That's true. Jack Northrop was a very compassionate man, and he felt seriously about the veterans that came back missing arms and legs. So he had his engineers, and he worked with them to design a special artificial arm that, by the way, is still in use today. And it employed aircraft materials and aircraft control techniques, and it proved very successful. They set up a shop in the Veterans Hospital in Van Nuys, and they had people there actually building parts for the P-61 Black Widow, which we built during the war. And these people were considered just like regular employees, and after they recuperated, they came to work at Northrop.
And these prosthetic devices were pretty incredible, because at that time they were very, very, there wasn't much out there. They were wooden, plastic, heavy, cumbersome devices.
Right.
And so these devices were a lot more maneuverable for the people that used them, and certainly made their life easier and more productive.
A lot more maneuverable.
We
And,
have somewhere a picture of a P-38 Black Widow. I wanted to talk about that. That was really the true first night fighter, wasn't it?
The first true night fighter in the world, yeah. It could track enemy aircraft at night. It had a large radar in the nose, which was very new at that time, but that would allow them to detect enemy aircraft in the air.
And you had something to do with the design of this. You actually got a ride in one of these once, didn't you?
Yeah, I had two rides in this P-61. I was sitting in the second seat here, and we went out over the ocean, and the pilot fired the guns. It was very, very thrilling.
On the top of the fuselage, it has a rotating turret for the guns.
You know, these guns can go fully around, and the guns were also able to go up and down. The idea was to fly up underneath an enemy bomber and point the guns up and shoot the bomber in the bottom.
Now, one question we talked about earlier, I asked what would prevent the gunner from shooting the tail off his own aircraft if this turret were turned around and faced that way?
We did have mechanical electrical interrupters that prevented the pilot from shooting at that point. He could not shoot the tail off.
So he could only shoot it at certain angles.
Yes.
But there were he had a lot of coverage.
Oh, he had a lot of coverage, yeah.
And this pitot tube mast, that's part of what you designed.
Yeah, I actually designed the pitot tube mast, and it was a combination pitot tube mast and had a little window in the front to allow the gun sight camera to look out. So as the airplane fired its guns, it got camera coverage of the target.
And were there also guns in the wings here?
There were 450 caliber guns in the turret, but there were also 4 20-millimeter cannon in the belly of the airplane. But there were no guns in the wing. It was all fuel.
It looks a little similar to a B-25, doesn't it?
As a matter of fact, this airplane used the B-25 landing gear.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Very interesting. So you started with Northrop in 1941, right about the time of Pearl Harbor.
Right.
And you still do consulting for Northrop today in 2001.
I'm still working for Northrop. It's been 59 plus years.
That's a very long time.
Yeah. And I served during the war as an engineer because I had hearing problems that kept me out of the service. But so I was here steadily from 1941 on.
So you've seen a lot of interesting things come through here, I'm sure.
I've seen a lot of things grow in Hawthorne, seen the airport grow. It's been very thrilling.
Well, I think what we ought to do is go outside, and I'd like to have you explain some of the functions of the various aircraft that you were, in fact, the engineers on. This is the horizontal tail of a trainer. This is a T-38 trainer that is supersonic in nature and is where the pilots that'll fly the more fast aircraft later on will train in this. And you can see that there's a spar that on the bottom of this, a round tube, where it actually just slips into the fuselage of the back of this white T-38 that we're looking at behind me.
At Mach 1.2 gives the Air Force students a chance to experience supersonic flight. This wing is an original wing. It was built 40 years ago, and it has 10,000 flight hours on it. So it's time to replace the wing. And the Air Force gave Northrop a contract to build about 200 more wings, which they will replace on their airplanes. But they all have a life hour. This is a fatigue life hour of 10,000 hours.
So at about 10,000 hours, as engineers, you know that from the flex of this wing flying, landing, taking off, and going into inverted flight, at about 10,000 hours, it would be like twisting the cap of a soda pop can till it breaks.
That's right.
And so they're actually remanufacturing these wings so that these planes can continue to fly and train today.
That's right, and the new wings will be a more exotic material, a more fatigue-resistant material.
So will they have a longer life than 10,000?
They will probably have a longer life than 10,000.
Okay.
And, that's part of technology advancement.
Now this particular trainer has room for a pilot and a flight instructor, so to speak?
Yeah, the flight instructor sits in the rear seat, the pilot sits in the front seat, and it takes them through the final stage of basic training and lets them do supersonic flight. But it's the next thing to a fighter airplane. And actually, this airplane was transformed into the N-156 fighter, which only has one person, and space in the nose where the student